Hello everyone, welcome to Ignition.
Hello, welcome back. Now today we're going to be refurbing our calipers and changing our brake discs.
Right, so we're going to be changing the discs and the calipers.
Yeah, my nose isn't blocking any of the picture.
We've got a fair job to do on these calipers. As you can see, they've got paint on them where the wheels have been done badly.
Yes.
So we don't like that, do we?
No, we don't like the rust. As you can see, as you've watched, hopefully you've watched the other ones, we've put some very nice dampers on. We've put some polyurethane bushings. I keep calling them silicon, so I do apologise about that. Got a silicon fetish. Keep calling them silicon. They are polyurethane.
A silicon fetish. Oh,
indeed.
Oh,
well,
nice. Anyway, so there's a big lip on these discs, so they're due for a change. It's a bit more difficult than usual because we've got this locking wheel nut hub thing here, so this is going to be an interesting experience getting this off. It's the first time for me. First time for you, is it?
Well, I'm not going to be doing it, you are.
So yeah, we've got this to take off, so we're going to go through the procedures and see how it goes.
And I'm just going to stand here and, as always, look pretty.
Okay, so our first job here is to remove the bracket that holds the brake line into the caliper, and once we've removed the bracket, we'll remove the actual pipe here that goes into the caliper, and we'll hang it up so we don't drain any fluid. So I'm going to crack on with this. So now I've cranked this one off, we are going to get a leak, so I think I'll grab a bucket just to make sure I don't make a mess. Okay, so it's just having a couple of drips now. My trusty assistant's got some cable ties for us to just tie it up in the wheel well, so no more fluid will drain out.
Glamorous assistant.
Sorry, glamorous assistant, yes. And out it comes. Now we can lift that up to stop our leakage.
Glamorous assistant.
Glamorous assistant job. He's holding that up. I'm just going to cable tie it in.
Trip just about stopped.
Okay, that's good news. Right, so we've moved around to the back of the caliper here, and the two main bolts that actually hold it to the car are here and up here. Now they're 17mm. They'll be on there very tight, so I might need a breaker bar, but I'm going to try with the ratchet first. 100% a breaker bar job. There we are. Right, so now the two bolts are out, there's just two final ones, little ones that hold on this sort of protection plate behind the disc. So there's one at the bottom of the caliper and one at the top. So I'll have those off quickly. There's one for you. So the pads don't want to come out. Now, as this is the case, we're going to have to remove the side bolt here and just flip up the middle part of the caliper. So the caliper was putting up a real fight, so the bottom bolt wasn't enough, so we undid the top one as well, just to release it in two parts. Right, we're well and truly, here we are, no, we're off,
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, it's going to larrup that.
And that should slide off, yeah, and we're up there. There's the first one, certainly not the cleanest. Okay, so here we are with the piston part of our caliper. Now, we're going to be using air, which makes this very easy. Well, I say easy, quite scary actually. Now, if we flip that over, they're fully extended, ready to come out. Now, what I'll do is place a slightly thinner piece and get them to come out a bit further. There they are. Now the key to this is don't shoot them all with nothing protecting the caliper, because if the speed they come out at, they will completely destroy the metal here. Out it comes. And piston 2, out it comes. Okay, so I'm going to remove the other seal here, that's well in there. That comes out like so. And then there's two rings that sit flush with the metal in here, and they just need to come out. Easily done with a flathead screwdriver or a pry tool. Just something very thin, just to get underneath them and dislodge them from their space. Okay, so those two are out. Now this is completely dismantled. That's really all that there is to it. Now my dad's going to clean them up, and we need to be very careful inside the piston cylinder, like the cylinder here that the piston goes into, that we keep it clean. And when we sandblast this, we really need to make sure no grit goes in there at all. One bit of grit and that's it, the end of the caliper. Okay, so in preparation for sandblasting and powder coating, we've got 2 pistons of the same size. If you've got new pistons, you can reuse the old ones as sacrificial ones as such. And I've lined these with, this is a high temperature masking tape we have for powder coating, and it fits one layer nicely around, and it saves me putting the seals back inside the piston housing, so these sit in nicely and protect the cylinder whilst I'm powder coating and sandblasting. So they go in like so. And then I'm going to reuse an old bleed nipple here. You can see I've used that to powder coat a few times, and I'm going to put that inside its original location here, and that just protects the threads of the caliper. In that goes. Okay, so here we are. Here's another sacrificial bolt going in, just to protect the threads. That's all the aim is here, so you don't get any grit or grime inside. These threads aren't as important, but I'm still going to cover them up just to make sure that there's no problems when reinstalling. Over here on the sliding part, all I've got to do is put 2 bolts in here to protect the threads in there. We're going to use the old sliding pins here. As you can see, we've done that before, because they actually have a really nice seal over the tubing here, so there's no problem with grit or paint getting in there. All prepared for sandblasting. I'll take them over to my dad, who's going to do it. In goes part number 1. Here they are, sandblasted and prepped for powder coating. Now if you're interested in powder coating, make sure to go back to last week's video we did, which was an in-depth video on how we powder coat. So let's crack on and see the final results. Right, so here are our parts, powder coated, looking great. Now I've got this rebuild kit, here we are, you can see all these new components. And the first thing we're going to start off with are these 2 O-rings. Now these O-rings just sit inside the piston housing here, just like so. And the best thing to use, I find, for lubrication, I've got a pot of, this is DOT4 brake fluid, and I'm just using that, as they'll be full of it at a later date anyway. I use this just to lubricate the parts and get them on. It does make life a bit easier. So this ring, there's a little indentation inside the housing, and I try and get the bottom in, and then just work it all the way around until it pops into place.
My parenting advice has always been to lube the ring.
Lube the ring, has it? Nice of you to come over just for your witty comments. So there we are, there's one installed. Second one, get a little bit of lubrication on there. So once you're done, rub your finger around, make sure that it's all nicely flush, which it is. And then the next job is to get the pistons in with these. So whilst we're waiting on the pistons to come over, I'm going to grease this up inside and out. Well, I suppose grease, lubricate it with the brake fluid yet again. There's our 2 pistons, looking very good, thank you. That goes over the piston. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it down over to the back of the piston, because we need to seat this ring, and you can't seat it with the piston inside, you need to move it around. So what I'm going to do is bring it to the back. Now where this sort of lip is just hanging over the back, like so. And then what I'm going to do is there's a small lip in front of this O-ring that we've put in before. There's another small metal sort of indentation all the way around, and that's where this lip sits. So if I move that out of the way, I'll get the bottom in, because I can't see it, so it's easier to get the bottom in so you know it is, and then work with the top. So you can see it sort of comes up here a bit, so you've got to work it to a point and then push the point in, like so, and then it's just flush, and it all should be seated nicely. Check around, which it is, and then what I'm going to do is simply just push the piston. Might take a bit of wiggling, but wiggle the piston and get it into place, and then push it all the way in until you've got this indentation on the piston. That just needs to go over the bushing there, and there we go. So it sort of seats itself in that lip, and now that's all the way in, ready for the brake pad to go in. So second one's got to go on. That's this side with the pistons complete. That can move to the side now. And now we're moving on to the slider. So this is actually the part that moves. Okay, so this is the lube I'm going to be moving to. The brake fluid we're going to put to the side, as this bit does move and it's not pumped full of brake fluid. So we're going to be using this red rubber grease. It has a picture of a caliper on it, so I think we're in the right direction there. So we're going to put it in sort of inside the gaps here. It doesn't take much at all. Before you do, make sure you clean these thoroughly. We've sprayed it with degreaser and brake fluid cleaner, just to make sure it's absolutely clean. So the two sliders that go in here, they're slightly different. There's one there you can see that's got a dent on it here. So what sits on there is this rubber sort of, you can't quite see it there, this sort of rubber cover that goes over. So that assists with the sliding, makes it a bit stiffer, I think. So what I'm going to do is just put a bit on the end of there, put a bit on the end of there, and then I've just got to slide it over the pin. Now the grease does obviously help with this, so that just slots over and then sits on there. I use the excess grease to cover the pin. Okay, so now that's covered in grease, we've got these bushings that sit over the top that keep the debris out from the slider. So I'm going to put a little bit on there, leave that balancing on the top. I don't want to get any debris in there. So I'm just going to put a bit inside here, fill that up. Now there's a different to each end. There's a sort of end with knobbly bits on it. It looks a bit more aggressive. That sits over here because it's this is where it really seats itself. So the smaller end sits on there. That sort of pushes itself into place like so. You feel it nicely slide and suck over. It is quite satisfying. So then it goes in there. I'm just going to use my fingers here to push this bottom seal over the little lip. It is difficult when everything is so slimy. One half, there we are. And now that's seated. I'm just going to give the top a wipe because that's going to have thread locker, so we don't want grease in there. And that's one side done, as you can see. And the second side is an exact repeat. There we go. So now we've got to put it together. Right, so what happens is these two runners we've installed, they go onto this side of the caliper. So they sit like so, there. Now we've got these thread locker bolts that came with the kit. They've got red thread locker on those, nice and strong. And what you do is just pop that through and it threads into the top half there. I'm going to get that started. And then the exact same on the other side. And I'm just going to tighten those up nice and confidently. They've got red thread locker on them, so you don't have to go mental. Just a nice reassuring tighten for a wimpy man like me. Now there we are, that's built, and like I say, what you're looking for is a nice spring back action on those. As you can see, they're running really nicely. But if you have any grit inside here, they're going to be horribly grindy and it will completely knacker the sliding pin. So you really need to take your time on cleaning here, as my glamorous assistant has done. And a good job, sir. Thank you for the cleaning.
Thank you.
So now that's our caliper rebuilt. The next thing to do is the brake pads. Now they're our final piece to go in. So we've got our runners here. So what these do is the brake pads actually sort of clip in here and they sit and hold in place with these. So what this does is this goes inside here like so, sort of slide it across, and then all it does is clip into the caliper. So at the final you should see like that in there, and then it's exactly the same for the other side of the caliper. And in we are. So we're ready to put the pads on now. Now on these pads, the old one has this is a wear indicator. So this came with our pads. So the wear indicator goes on the inside of the piston. So this is the inside of the caliper. So they sit on the inside. So whichever side is closest to the pistons, they go on. Now before we put those in, what we're going to do is Glamorous Assistant's going to cover these in a light coating of copper grease. Slide it in and pop it into these grooves that are cut out for this. Now I'm just going to slide that back until it touches the piston. There we go. So one side's in and there's the other. So what that does is that just sits opposite, and now the rotor goes in between and that moves accordingly when you press the brake pedal. So that's completely rebuilt. Next job is the disc, so let's crack on with that. Okay, so we've moved over to the rotor now. So on these older 4x4s it's a bit different. We've got this locking sort of wheel nut here, so we've got to get this plate out, which is attached to the rotor. So we've got to go through here and take the bearing out and all sorts. So we're going to go through it now piece by piece and see how it goes. Okay, so first we're going to pop this off, and that protects sort of the teeth on this gear here, which is your drive shaft. On here we've got a C-clip which goes around. There's a little indentation in the sort of spline there, which this C-ring sits in. Now we've got to sort of pry it open and slide it off, which can be difficult sometimes. So I'm going to hold one and open the other. There we go. Now I should be able to get that off by hand. Right, there we are. No pinging. Happy days. And then behind that there's a very small flat washer, which is almost invisible to the eye. There we are. Bring that forwards. Making sure not to lose it. There it is. Okay, so now we've taken the C-clip off, we can work on to taking off these 14mm bolts. Okay, so now that we've taken off these bolts and the C-clips off, this plate here is free, so that wiggles off, as you can see. There we go. Okay, so our next job is these Phillips screws. There's two of them which secure, when you tighten the bearing, these secure it so it can't come loose. So we're going to take those out next. So these have little washers on, make sure not to lose those. Interesting design, I wouldn't have thought there'd be a Phillips screw anywhere near a bearing, but there we are. Okay, so next there's this small piece which we've undone. So what this needs is just a little bit of prying to come out. It's now like a spacer. There it comes, you can see. And it locks into place with that there. So it physically can't turn. So that's what locks the bearing so it doesn't come loose. Okay, so now what this has is two screw holes which we had been screwed into, and there are, which are hidden in grease, two more holes. Now there's a specialist tool for this, but I physically can't find one on the internet, and on forums what they do is they use a socket and file it down and insert it to loosen and tighten. But also other people, as another method, is to tap it loose, so you can undo it by tapping to the side, and then this releases the pressure on the bearing in here. So just don't use the threaded holes because you'll damage the threads. Use the two that are given here, which are specifically for that. It shouldn't take too much, as these are only torqued up to about 25 to 30 Newton meters anyway. And there we are, now it's loose. Okay, so I'm just going to unspin that all the way off the thread. And what that does is tighten up your bearing. That is what's holding the bearing in. There it is. And then I'm going to bring it back and I'll get my dad. Can you catch the bearing there? As you're...
I get the dirty work.
Yeah. So that's the bearing. There is the beauty. And what I'm going to do is just slide this off. And there we have it. A very heavy and complicated rotor. Okay, so next job is to remove this metal piece with the hub on it from the disc. There we are. Okay, so as this disc's been on the car for so long, this will have probably welded itself to the disc, so a hammer is in order to just dislodge it, and then it should pull out nicely. Wiggle it. And there we are, it's off. Now we will be reusing this piece, but the rotor we will be changing. Right, so the front hub assembly's got to go back into the new disc here. So what this does is it sits through the new disc and we line it up with some holes. There we go. And what I'm going to do is stand it up, put a couple of bolts through, stand it up. My dad will hold one side and I'll do the other. Makes life a bit easier. Okay, so we're applying sort of a medium strength thread locker. Don't want these coming off. And all these bolts get torqued down to 59 Newton meters. Okay, so here we are. We've re-greased inside, made sure it's nice and clean. Torqued up our bolts. Now this goes back on in the reverse order, so I'm going to be careful popping it over. Try not to dislodge any grease that we've got in there. And now we need the bearing to go in, so we're installing it all in the reverse order. That's the bearing going in now. Sorry about my dad's muscular shoulders. Okay, and now our next piece to reinstall is our bearing tightener, tensioner, whatever you call it. So to tighten this up, there is a specific tool, but no one on the forums is showing a tool to purchase. So we don't have one, and I've seen a few techniques on the internet. So what you do is you tighten this up until you feel resistance on your brake turning here, and as soon as there is resistance, turn it off quarter of a turn, and that should be tight. It's better to be loose than tight. We don't want any movement. If it's too tight, the bearing will blow up. So that's straightforward, just don't over tighten it. Okay, so we've got some good tension on there now, so I'm just going to slacken it off sort of quarter of a turn. And now there's literally no resistance on that at all, so that should be perfect. But like I say, it's better to be loose than tight. If you've got wobble, you need to tighten it out more, but if you have resistance and it's difficult to turn, then you know you're too tight. And the next thing to install is our securing washer. So what that does is stops that from coming loose. So there's a little groove at the top. I'll move the grease out of the way. There's a small groove which just sits in and goes in there. Now you may need to slightly move the piece that tightens the washer just to line it up with the bolts, but in my case I look like I'm lined up. And the opposite, there's a lot of grease, so I'm trying to find my way through the grease. So now our job here is to just make sure that the edge of this piece, which I'm wiping now, is completely clean, as we do need to install a sealant. So we'll be using a gasket sealant just to pop around here. So, on there. Now I'm going to place him in. Okay, so we've got that torqued up now. Just going to give that end a wipe off. And now we've just got to reinstall the C-clip and the little washer that goes behind the C-clip, and then the dust cover. He goes like that. Pop that in, out the way. And then it's the C-clip. Now these can be a real pain, these C-clips. And I'm going to use the flathead to push one side in. So, the C-clip, as you can see, is on. Now they can be a bit tricky, but what I do is hold that side and just ping it on. And then the dust cover's the last thing to go on. It's caliper time. Now, the caliper's going to be going on here with Loctite on these two bolts. There we are. And the bottom one. There we are. Okay, so this is behind the caliper. Now we've got to put in our bleed nipple, and we've also got to attach the bracket and the entry where the fluid comes in. So let me pop the new bleed nipple. Now on the bleed nipple you really don't want to go over tight, because we've had problems with these in the past. They've been over tightened, and then once they round off, that's it, the end of the caliper. So we've put that in just gently snug so nothing comes out. And then there's two bolts on this sort of dust shield on the rotor, one at the top of the caliper, one at the bottom. So we've got them to put in next. There you go.
Are they also number 10?
They certainly are. Now we've got to refeed this brake pipe, feed this into the bottom, and he'll just screw in like so. And that's a beloved 10mm as well. Right, so we'll do that up snug. Here we are. And the final two are the bolts that hold the bracket on. And there we are, caliper is all installed. Now that the caliper's done, I've got the joys of doing it all again on the other side. Now as you can see, I've sped it up, I don't want to bore you too much, but now I'll go on to brake bleeding. Now the final and also a very crucial step to the build is bleeding the brakes, getting the air out of the system. Now if you're interested in brake bleeding, next week we'll have an in-depth video all about it. So hopefully you stay tuned, and if you've enjoyed the video, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.